Good evening and welcome back to Cecilia. I've had a couple of quite busy days this week, so I'm sorry for the lack of updates recently. In the meantime, I have made a fantasy cast and mood board, which you can find on the Facebook page, link in the description below. So we now move on to volume 4, which is, considering I think there are 6 volumes, am I right? This is the sort of thing I could have looked up before pressing record. No, there are only 5 volumes. Oh my goodness. So we've had, how many books have we had? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We've had 6 books out of 10. So, folks, we are over halfway through. I can't believe we're doing this. I can't believe I'm reading so much out loud. This is incredible. Thank you for your support. Let's get started because things are going to get interesting. Maybe not entirely today, but tomorrow. Tomorrow they're going to be very interesting indeed. Volume 4, Book 7, Chapter 1, A Renovation. Cecilia was accompanied by her maid in the chaise, and her own servant and one of Mrs. Delvile's attended her on horseback. The quietness of her dejection was soon interrupted by a loud cry among the men of "Home! Home! Home!" She then looked out of one of the windows, and perceived Fidèle running after the carriage and barking at the servants, who were all endeavouring to send him back. Touched by this proof of the animal's gratitude for her attention to him, and conscious she had herself occasioned his master's leaving him, the scheme of Lady Honoria occurred to her, and she almost wished to put it in execution. But this was the thought of a moment, and motioning him with her hand to go back, she desired Mrs. Delvile's man to return with him immediately, and commit him to the care of somebody in the castle. This little incident, however trifling, was the most important of her journey, for she arrived at the house of Mrs. Charlton without meeting any other. The sight of that lady gave her a sensation of pleasure to which she had long been a stranger, pleasure pure, unmixed, unaffected, and unrestrained. It revived all her early affection, and with it something resembling at least her early tranquillity. Again she was in the house where it had once been undisturbed. Again she enjoyed the society which was once all she had wished, and again saw the same scene, the same faces, the same prospects she had beheld while her heart was all devoted to her friends. Mrs. Charlton, though old and infirm, preserved an understanding which, whenever unbiassed by her affections, was sure to direct her unerringly. But the extreme softness of her temper frequently misled her judgment, by making it at the pleasure either of misfortune or of artifice always yield to compassion and pliant to entreaty. Where her counsel and opinion were demanded, they were certain to reflect honour on her capacity and discernment. But where her assistance or her pity were supplicated, her purse and her tears were immediately bestowed, and in her zeal to alleviate distress, she forgot if the object were deserving her solicitude, and stopped not to consider propriety or discretion, if happiness, however momentary, were in her power to grant. This generous foible was, however, kept somewhat in subjection by the watchfulness of 2 granddaughters, who, fearing the injury they might themselves receive from it, failed not to point out both its inconvenience and its danger. These ladies were daughters of a deceased and only son of Mrs. Charlton. They were single, and lived with their grandmother, whose fortune, which was considerable, they expected to share between them, and they waited with eagerness for the moment of appropriation. Narrow-minded and rapacious, they wished to monopolize whatever she possessed, and thought themselves aggrieved by her smallest donations. Their chief employment was to keep from her all objects of distress, and in this, though they could not succeed, they at least confined her liberality to such as resembled themselves, since neither the spirited could brook nor the delicate support the checks and rebuffs from the granddaughters, which followed the gifts of Mrs. Charlton. Cecilia, of all her acquaintance, was the only one whose intimacy they encouraged, for they knew her fortune made her superior to any mercenary views, and they received from her themselves more civilities than they paid. Mrs. Charlton loved Cecilia with an excess of fondness, that not only took place of the love she bore her other friends, but to which even her regard for the Miss Charltons was inferior and feeble. Cecilia, when a child, had reverenced her as a mother, and, grateful for her tenderness and care, had afterwards cherished her as a friend. The revival of this early connection delighted them both. It was balm to the wounded mind of Cecilia. It was renovation to the existence of Mrs Charlton. Early the next morning she wrote a card to Mr Monckton and Lady Margaret, acquainting them with her return into Suffolk, and desiring to know when she might pay her respects to her ladyship. She received from the old lady a verbal answer, when she pleased, but Mr Monckton came instantly himself to Mrs Charlton's. His astonishment, his rapture, at this unexpected incident were almost boundless. He thought it a sudden turn of fortune in his own favour, and concluded, now she had escaped the danger of Delvile Castle, the road was short and certain that led to his own security. Her satisfaction in the meeting was sincere, though not so animated as his own. But this similarity in their feelings was of short duration, for when he inquired into what had passed at the castle, with the reasons for her quitting it, the pain she felt in giving even a cursory and evasive account was opposed on his part by the warmest delight in hearing it. He could not obtain from her the particulars of what had happened, but the reluctance with which she spoke, the air of mortification with which she heard his questions, and the evident displeasure which was mingled in her chagrin when he forced her to mention Delvile, were all proofs the most indisputable and satisfactory, that they had either parted without any explanation, or with one by which Cecilia had been hurt and offended. He now readily concluded that since the fiery trial he had most apprehended was over, and she had quitted in anger the asylum she had sought in ecstasy, Delvile himself did not covet the alliance, which, since they were separated, was never likely to take place. He had therefore little difficulty in promising all success to himself. He's still married? She was once more upon the spot where she had regarded him as the first of men. He knew that during her absence no one had settled in the neighbourhood who had any pretensions to dispute with him that preeminence. He should again have access to her at pleasure, and so sanguine grew his hopes, that he almost began to rejoice even in the partiality to Delvile that had hitherto been his terror, from believing it would give her for a time that sullen distaste of all other connections, to which those who at once are delicate and fervent are commonly led by early disappointment. His whole solicitude therefore now was to preserve her esteem, to seek her confidence, and to regain whatever by absence might be lost of the ascendant over her mind which her respect for his knowledge and capacity had for many years given him. Fortune at this time seemed to prosper all his views, and by a stroke the most sudden and unexpected, to render more rational his hopes and his plans than he had himself been able to effect by the utmost craft of worldly wisdom. The day following, Cecilia, in Mrs Charlton's chaise, waited upon Lady Margaret. She was received by Miss Bennet, her companion, with the most fawning courtesy, but when conducted to the lady of the house, she saw herself so evidently unwelcome that she even regretted the civility which had prompted her visit. She found with her nobody but Mr Maurice, who was the only young man who could persuade himself to endure her company in the absence of her husband, but who, in common with most young men who are assiduous in their attendance upon old ladies, doubted not but he ensured himself a handsome legacy for his trouble. Almost the first speech which her ladyship made was, "So, you are not married yet, I find. If Mr Monckton had been a real friend, he would have taken care to have seen for some establishment for you." "I was by no means," cried Cecilia with spirit, "either in so much haste or distress as to require from Mr Monckton any such exertions of his friendship." "Ma'am," cried Maurice, "what a terrible night we had of it at Vauxhall! Poor Harrel! I was really excessively sorry for him. I had not courage to see you or Mrs Harrel after it, but as soon as I heard you in St James's Square I tried to wait on you, for really going to Mr Harrel's again would have been quite too dismal. I would rather have run a mile by the side of a race-horse." "There is no occasion for any apology," said Cecilia, "for I was very little disposed either to see or think of visitors." "So I thought, ma'am," answered he with quickness, "and really that made me the less alert in finding you out. However, ma'am, next winter I shall be excessively happy to make up for the deficiency. Besides, I shall be much obliged to you to introduce me to Mr Delvile, for I have a great desire to be acquainted with him." Mr Delvile, thought Cecilia, would be but too proud to hear it. However, she merely answered that she had no present prospect of spending any time at Mr Delvile's next winter. "True, ma'am, true," cried he. Now, I recollect, you become your own mistress between this and then, and so I suppose you will naturally choose a house of your own, which will be much more eligible." "I don't think that," said Lady Margaret. "I never saw anything eligible come of young women's having houses of their own. She will do much better thing to marry, and have some proper person to take care of her." "Nothing more right, ma'am," returned he. "A young lady in a house by herself must be subject to 1,000 dangers. What sort of place, ma'am, has Mr Delvile got in the country? I hear he has a good deal of ground there, and a large house." "It is an old castle, sir, and situated in a park." "That must be terribly forlorn. I dare say, ma'am, you were very happy to return into Suffolk." "I did not find it forlorn. I was very well satisfied with it." "Why, indeed, upon second thoughts, I don't much wonder. An old castle in a large park must make a very romantic appearance. Something noble in it, I dare say." "Aye," cried Lady Margaret, "they said you were to become mistress of it, and marry Mr Delvile's son, and I cannot for my own part see any objection in it." "I am told of so many strange reports," said Cecilia, "and all to myself so unaccountable, that I begin now to hear of them without much wonder." "That's a charming young man, I believe," said Maurice. "I had the pleasure once or twice of meeting him at poor Harold's, and he seemed mighty agreeable. Is not he so, ma'am?" "Yes, I believe so." "Nay, I don't mean to speak of him as anything very extraordinary," cried Maurice, imagining her hesitation proceeded from dislike. "I merely meant as the world goes, in a common sort of way." Here they were joined by Mr Monckton and some gentlemen who were on a visit to his house, for his anxiety was not of a sort to lead him to solitude, nor his disposition to make him deny himself any kind of enjoyment which he had power to attain. A general conversation ensued, which lasted till Cecilia ended her visit. Mr Monckton then took her hand to lead her to the chaise, but told her in their way out of some alterations in his grounds, which he desired to show her. His view of detaining her was to gather what she thought of her reception, and whether she had yet any suspicions of the jealousy of Lady Margaret, well knowing from the delicacy of her character that if once she became acquainted with it, she would scrupulously avoid all intercourse with him for the fear of increasing her uneasiness. He began, therefore, with talking of the pleasure which Lady Margaret took in the plantations, and of his hope that Cecilia would often favour her by visiting them, without waiting to have her visits returned, as she was entitled by her infirmities to particular indulgences. He was continuing in this strain, receiving from Cecilia hardly any answer, when suddenly from behind a thick laurel bush jumps up Mr Maurice, who had run out of the house by a shorter cut, and planted himself there to surprise them. "So ho!" cried he with a loud laugh, "I have caught you. This will be a fine anecdote for Lady Margaret. I vow I'll tell her." Mr Monckton, never off his guard, readily answered, "Ay, prithee do, Maurice, but don't omit to relate also what we said of yourself." "Of me?" cried he with some eagerness. "Why, you never mentioned me." "Oh, that won't pass, I assure you. We shall tell another tale at table by and by, and bring the old proverb of the ill luck of listeners upon you in its full force." "Well, I'll be hanged if I know what you mean." "Why, you won't pretend you did not hear Miss Beverley say you were the truest orangutan or man monkey she ever knew?" "No, indeed, that I did not." "No? Nor how much she admired your dexterity in escaping being horsewhipped 3 times a day for your incurable impudence?" "Not a word on it. Horsewhipped! Miss Beverley, pray did you say any such thing?" "Ay," cried Monckton again, "and not only horsewhipped, but horse-ponded, for she thought when one had heated, the other might cool you, and then you might be fitted again for your native woods, for she insists upon it you were as brought from Africa, and are not yet half tamed." "O Lord!" cried Maurice, amazed, "I should not have suspected Miss Beverley would have talked so." "And do you suspect she did now?" cried Cecilia. "Pooh, pooh!" cried Monckton coolly. "Why, he heard it himself the whole time, and so shall all our party by and by, if I can but remember to mention it." Cecilia then returned to the chaise, leaving Mr Monckton to settle the matter with his credulous guest as he pleased, for supposing he was merely gratifying a love of sport, or taking this method of checking the general forwardness of the young man, she forbore any interference that might mar his intention. But Mr Monckton loved not to be rallied concerning Cecilia, though he was indifferent to all that could be said to him of any other woman. He meant therefore to intimidate Maurice from renewing the subject, and he succeeded to his wish. Poor Maurice, whose watching and whose speech were the mere blunders of chance, made without the slightest suspicion of Mr. Monckton's designs, now apprehended some scheme to render himself ridiculous, and though he did not believe Cecilia had made use of such expressions, he fancied Mr. Monckton meant to turn the laugh against him, and determined therefore to say nothing that might remind him of what had passed. Mr. Monckton had at this time admitted him to his house merely from an expectation of finding more amusement in his blundering and giddiness than he was capable, during his anxiety concerning Cecilia, of receiving from conversation of a higher sort. The character of Maurice was indeed particularly adapted for the entertainment of a large house in the country. Eager for sport and always ready for enterprise, willing to oblige, yet tormented with no delicacy about offending, the first to promote mischief for any other, and the last to be offended when exposed to it himself, gay, thoughtless, and volatile, a happy companion of levity and good humour. Cecilia, however, in quitting the house, determined not to visit it again very speedily, for she was extremely disgusted with Lady Margaret, though she suspected no particular motives of enmity, against which she was guarded alike by her own unsuspicious innocence, and by a high esteem of Mr. Monckton, which she firmly believed he returned with equal honesty of undesigning friendship. Her next excursion was to visit Mrs. Harrel. She found that unhappy lady a prey to all the misery of unoccupied solitude. Torn from whatever had, to her, made existence seem valuable, her mind was as listless as her person was inactive, and she was at a loss how to employ even a moment of the day. She had now neither a party to form, nor an entertainment to plan, company to arrange, nor dress to consider, and these, with visits and public places, had filled her time since her marriage, which, as it had happened very early in her life, had merely taken place of girlish amusements, masters, and governesses. This helplessness of insipidity, however, though naturally the effect of a mind devoid of all genuine resources, was dignified by herself with the appellation of sorrow. Nor was this merely a screen to the world. Unused to investigate her feelings or examine her heart, the general compassion she met for the loss of her husband persuaded her that indeed she lamented his destiny, though had no change in her life been caused by his suicide, she would scarcely, when the first shock was over, have thought of it again. She received Cecilia with great pleasure, and with still greater heard the renewal of her promises to fit up a room for her in her house as soon as she came of age, a period which now was hardly a month distant. Far greater, however, as well as infinitely purer, was the joy which her presence bestowed upon Mr. Arnott. She saw it herself with a sensation of regret, not only at the constant passion which occasioned it, but even at her own inability to participate in or reward it. For with him an alliance would meet with no opposition. His character was amiable, his situation in life unexceptionable. He loved her with the tenderest affection, and no pride, she well knew, would interfere to overpower it. Yet in return to grant him her love, she felt as utterly impossible as to refuse him her esteem. And the superior attractions of Delvile, of which neither displeasure nor mortification could rob him, shut up her heart for the present more firmly than ever, as Mr. Monckton had well imagined, to all other assailants. Yet she by no means weakly gave way to repining or regret. Her suspense was at an end, her hopes and her fears were subsided into certainty. Delvile, in quitting her, had acquainted her that he had left her for ever, and even though not, indeed, with much steadiness, had prayed for her happiness in union with some other. She held it therefore as essential to her character as to her peace to manifest equal fortitude in subduing her partiality. She forbore to hint to Mrs. Charlton what had passed, that the subject might never be started, allowed herself no time for dangerous recollection, strolled in her old walks and renewed her old acquaintance, and by a vigorous exertion of active wisdom doubted not completing before long the subjection of her unfortunate tenderness. Nor was her task so difficult as she had feared. Resolution in such cases may act the office of time, and anticipate by reason and self-denial what that much less nobly effects through forgetfulness and inconstancy. Oh, well, isn't that nice? It's so good that she's able to will away all her feelings for Delvile, and that the rest of the novel will be filled with her active employment as a single lady, with no romantic entanglements, and total peace of mind undisturbed by her love for Delvile. Isn't it lovely how feelings work that way, and you can just switch them off by not thinking about them and not talking about them? I'm so pleased for Cecilia. It's such an inspiration. Chapter 2. A Visit. 1 week only, however, had yet tried the perseverance of Cecilia, when while she was working with Mrs. Charlton in her dressing room, her maid hastily entered it, and with a smile that seemed announcing welcome news, said, "Lord, ma'am, here's Fidel!" And at the same moment she was followed by the dog, who jumped upon Cecilia in a transport of delight. "Good heaven!" cried she, all amazement. "Who has brought him? Whence does he come?" "A countryman brought him, ma'am, but he only put him in, and would not stay a minute." "But whom did he inquire for? Who saw him? What did he say?" "He saw Ralph, ma'am." Ralph, then, was instantly called, and these questions being repeated, he said, "Ma'am, it was a man I never saw before, but he only bid me take care to deliver the dog into your own hands, and said you would have a letter about him soon, and then went away. I wanted him to stay till I came upstairs, but he was off at once." Cecilia, quite confounded by this account, could make neither comment nor answer, but as soon as the servants had left the room, Mrs. Charlton entreated to know to whom the dog had belonged, convinced by her extreme agitation that something interesting and uncommon must relate to him. There was no time for disguise. Astonishment and confusion bereft Cecilia of all power to attempt it, and after a very few evasions, she briefly communicated her situation with respect to Delvile, his leaving her, his motives, and his mother's evident concurrence, for these were all so connected with her knowledge of Fidel that she led to them unavoidably in telling what she knew of him. Very little penetration was requisite to gather from her manner all that was united in her narrative of her own feelings and disappointment in the course of this affair, and Mrs. Charlton, who had hitherto believed the whole world at her disposal, and that she continued single from no reason but her own difficulty of choice, was utterly amazed to find that any man existed who could withstand the united allurements of so much beauty, sweetness, and fortune. She felt herself sometimes inclined to hate, and at other times to pity him, yet concluded that her own extreme coldness was the real cause of his flight, and warmly blamed a reserve which had thus ruined her happiness. Cecilia was in the extremest perplexity and distress to conjecture the meaning of so unaccountable a present, and so strange a message. Delvile, she knew, had desired the dog might follow him to Bristol. His mother, always pleased to oblige him, would now less than ever neglect any opportunity. She could not therefore doubt that she had sent or taken him thither, and thence, according to all appearances, he must now come. But was it likely Delvile would take such a liberty? Was it probable, when so lately he had almost exhorted her to forget him, he would even wish to present her with such a remembrance of himself? And what was the letter she was bid to expect? Whence and from whom was it to come? All was inexplicable. The only thing she could surmise, with any semblance of probability, was that the whole was some frolic of Lady Honoria Pemberton, who had persuaded Delvile to send her the dog, and perhaps assured him she had herself requested to have him. Provoked by this suggestion, her first thought was instantly having him conveyed to the castle, but uncertain what the whole affair meant, and hoping some explanation in the letter she was promised, she determined to wait it till it came, or at least till she heard from Mrs. Delvile, before she took any measures herself in the business. Mutual accounts of their safe arrivals at Bristol and in Suffolk had already passed between them, and she expected very soon to have further intelligence, though she was now, by the whole behaviour of Mrs. Delvile, convinced she wished not again to have her an inmate of her house, and that the rest of her minority might pass without opposition in the house of Mrs. Charlton. Day after day, however, passed, and yet she heard nothing more. A week, a fortnight elapsed, and still no letter came. She now concluded the promise was a deception, and repented that she had waited a moment with any such expectation. Her peace during this time was greatly disturbed. This present made her fear she was thought meanly of by Mr. Delvile. The silence of his mother gave her apprehensions for his health, and her own irresolution how to act kept her in perpetual inquietude. She tried in vain to behave as if this incident had not happened. Her mind was uneasy, and the same actions produced not the same effects. When she now worked or read, the sight of Fidel by her side distracted her attention. When she walked, it was the same, for Fidel always followed her, and though in visiting her old acquaintance she forbore to let him accompany her, she was secretly planning the whole time the contents of some letter which she expected to meet with on returning to Mrs. Charlton's. just want to interrupt to say that I love the fact that Cecilia's walking around making up the contents of a letter someone else is going to send her, because I do that all the time. And I usually figure either it's going to be much, much better than reality or much, much worse. It's never as mundane as what one actually gets. Generally, people aren't wildly in love with you or hate you despicably, but are usually some measure of neutral indifference or mild feelings. Those gentlemen in the country, who during the lifetime of the Dean had paid their addresses to Cecilia, again waited upon her at Mrs. Charlton's and renewed their proposals. They had now, however, still less chance of success, and their dismission was brief and decisive. Among these came Mr. Biddulph, and to him Cecilia was involuntarily more civil, because she knew him to be the friend of Delvile. Yet his conversation increased the uneasiness of her suspense, for after speaking of the family in general which she had left, he inquired more particularly concerning Delvile, and then added, "I am indeed greatly grieved to find, by all accounts I receive of him, that he is now in a very bad state of health." This speech gave her fresh subject for apprehension, and in proportion as the silence of Mrs. Delvile grew more alarming, her regard for her favourite Fidèle became more partial. The affectionate animal seemed to mourn the loss of his master, and while sometimes she indulged herself in fancifully telling him her fears, she imagined she read in his countenance the faithfullest sympathy. 1 week of her minority was now all that remained, and she was soon wholly occupied in preparations for coming of age. She purposed taking possession of a large house that had belonged to her uncle, which was situated only 3 miles from that of Mrs. Charlton, and she employed herself in giving orders for fitting it up, and in hearing complaints and promising indulgences to various of her tenants. At this time, while she was at breakfast one morning, a letter arrived from Mrs. Delvile. She apologized for not writing sooner, but added that various family occurrences, which had robbed her of her all leisure, might easily be imagined, when she acquainted her that Mortimer had determined upon again going abroad. They were all, she said, returned to Delvile Castle, but mentioned nothing either of the health of her son or of her own regret, and filled up the rest of her letter with general news and expressions of kindness, though in a postscript was inserted, "We have lost our poor Fidèle." Cecilia was still meditating upon this letter, by which her perplexity how to act was rather increased than diminished, when to her great surprise Lady Honoria Pemberton was announced. She hastily begged one of the Miss Charltons to convey Fidèle out of sight, from a dread of her raillery, should she at last be unconcerned in the transaction, and then went to receive her. Lady Honoria, who was with her governess, gave a brief history of her quitting Delvile Castle, and said she was now going with her father to visit a noble family in Norfolk, but she had obtained his permission to leave him at the inn where they had slept, in order to make a short excursion to Bury, for the pleasure of seeing Miss Beverley. "And therefore," she continued, "I can stay but half an hour, so you must give me some account of yourself as fast as possible." "What account does your ladyship require?" "Why, who you live with here, and who are your companions, and what you do with yourself." "Why, I live with Mrs. Charlton, and for companions I have at least a score. Here are her 2 granddaughters, and Mrs. and Miss—" "Pooh, pooh," interrupted Lady Honoria, "but I don't mean such humdrum companions as those. You'll tell me next, I suppose, of the parson and his wife and 3 daughters, with all their cousins and aunts. I hate these sort of people. What I desire to hear of is, who are your particular favourites, and whether you take long walks here as you used to do at the castle, and who you have to accompany you." And then, looking at her very archly, she added, "A pretty little dog now, I should think, would be vastly agreeable in such a place as this. Ah, Miss Beverley, I see you have not left off that trick of colouring." "If I colour now," said Cecilia, fully convinced of the justness of her suspicions, "I think it must be for your ladyship, not myself; for if I am not much mistaken, either in person or by proxy, a blush from Lady Honoria Pemberton would not just now be wholly out of season." "Lord," cried she, "how like that is to a speech of Mrs. Delvile's! She has taught you exactly her manner of talking. But do you know, I am informed you have got Fidèle with you here. Oh, fie, Miss Beverley! What will papa and mamma say when they find you have taken away poor little master's plaything? And oh, fie, Lady Honoria! What shall I say when I find you guilty of this mischievous frolic? I must beg, however, since you have gone thus far, that you will proceed a little further, and send back the dog to the person from whom you received him." "No, not I. Manage him all your own way. If you choose to accept dogs from gentlemen, you know it is your affair and not mine." "If you really will not return him yourself, you must at least pardon me should you hear that I do in your ladyship's name." Lady Honoria for some time only laughed and rallied, without coming to any explanation. But when she had exhausted all the sport she could make, she frankly owned that she had herself ordered the dog to be privately stolen, and then sent a man with him to Mrs Charlton's. "But you know," she continued, "I really owed you a spite for being so ill-natured as to run away after sending me to call Mortimer to comfort and take leave of you." "Do you dream, Lady Honoria? When did I send you?" "Why, you know you looked as if you wished it, and that was the same thing. But really it made me appear excessively silly, when I had forced him to come back with me, and told him you were waiting for him, to see nothing of you at all, and not being able to find or trace you. He took it all for my own invention." "And was it not your own invention?" "Why, that's nothing to the purpose. I wanted him to believe you sent me, for I knew else he would not come." "Your ladyship was a great deal too good." "Why now, suppose I had brought you together, what possible harm could have happened from it? It would merely have given each of you some notion of a fever and ague. For first you would have both been hot, and then you would both have been cold, and then you would have both turned red, and then you would have both turned white, and then you would have both pretended to simper at the trick, and then there would have been an end to it." "This is a very easy way of settling it all," cried Cecilia, laughing. "However, you must be content to abide by your own theft, for you cannot in conscience expect I should take it upon myself." "You are terribly ungrateful, I see," said her ladyship, "for all the trouble and contrivance and expense I have been at merely to oblige you. Well, the whole time, poor Mortimer, I dare say, has had his sweet pet advertised in all the newspapers and cried in every market town in the kingdom. By the way, if you do send him back, I would advise you to let your man demand the reward that has been offered for him, which may serve in part of payment for his travelling expenses." Cecilia could only shake her head, and recollect Mrs Delvile's expression that her levity was incorrigible. "Oh, if you had seen," she continued, "how sheepish Mortimer looked when I told him you were dying to see him before he set off! He coloured so, just as you do now, but I think you're vastly alike." "I fear then," cried Cecilia, not very angry at this speech, "there is but little chance your ladyship should like either of us." "Oh yes, I do. I like odd people of all things." "Odd people? And in what a way are we so very odd?" "Oh, in 1,000 things. You're so good, you know, and so grave, and so squeamish." "Squeamish? How?" "Why, you know, you never laugh at the old folks, and never fly at your servants, nor smoke people before their faces, and are so civil to all the old fograms, you would make one imagine you like nobody so well. By the way, I could do no good with my little Lord Derford. He pretended to find out I was only laughing at him, and so he minded nothing I told him. I dare say, however, his father made the detection, for I am sure he had not wit enough to discover it himself." Cecilia then very seriously began to entreat that she would return the dog herself, and confess her frolic, remonstrating in strong terms upon the mischievous tendency and consequences of such inconsiderate slights. "Well," cried she, rising, "this is all vastly true, but I have no time to hear any more of it just now. Besides, it's only forestalling my next lecture from Mrs Delvile, for you talk so much alike that it is really very perplexing to me to remember which is which." She then hurried away, protesting she had already outstayed her father's patience, and declaring the delay of another minute would occasion 6 expresses to know whether she was gone towards Scotland or Flanders. This visit, however, was both pleasant and consolatory to Cecilia, who was now relieved from her suspense, and revived in her spirits by the intelligence that Delvile had no share in sending her a present, which from him would have been humiliating and impertinent. She regretted indeed that she had not instantly returned it to the castle, which she was now convinced was the measure she ought to have pursued, but to make all possible reparation, she determined that her own servant should set out with him the next morning to Bristol, and take a letter to Mrs Delvile to explain what had happened, since to conceal it from any delicacy to Honoria would be to expose herself to suspicions the most mortifying, for which that gay and careless young lady would never thank her. She gave orders, therefore, to her servant to get ready for the journey. When she communicated these little transactions to Mrs Charlton, that kind-hearted old lady, who knew her fondness for Fidèle, advised her not yet to part with him, but merely to acquaint Mrs Delvile where he was, and what Lady Honoria had done, and by leaving to herself the care of settling his restoration, to give her at least an opportunity of offering him to her acceptance. Cecilia, however, would listen to no such proposal. She saw the firmness of Delvile in his resolution to avoid her, and knew that policy, as well as propriety, made it necessary she should part with what she could only retain to remind her of one whom she now most wished to forget. Have a lovely evening.